She bulldozed through my family's legacy daily, trespassing, sabotaging my crops, and weaponizing the HOA to steal my land. But she picked the wrong retired federal agent to target. I'd spent 25 years hunting land fraud, and her legal threats were child's play. When she crossed the line, I unleashed every weapon in my arsenal, including Ferdinand, the 2,000-pound beast bull who'd become her worst nightmare. The ATV tore through my wheat field again, Rebecca Martinez, HOA president, smirking as she crushed months of work under her tires. She thought my silence meant surrender. She didn't see Ferdinand, my 2,000-pound bull, watching from the shadows, or know I was a federal agent who dismantled fraud rings far bigger than her little scam. Have you ever seen someone mistake silence for surrender? My name is James Mitchell, a 55-year-old retired chief inspector from the Federal Land Management Bureau. After decades enforcing land laws across 7 states, I thought I'd found peace on my 40-acre family farm in Greenfield Estates. But Rebecca Martinez, a 42-year-old real estate attorney and HOA president, saw my property as her golden ticket. What happens when a land fraud expert becomes the target? She was about to find out. Rebecca viewed my farm as an obstacle to her suburban vision and a potential gold mine if she could force me out. Beneath my quiet farmer exterior was someone who knew every legal angle she planned to exploit. The first confrontation happened on a crisp Monday morning that would change everything. I was checking my wheat just 3 weeks from harvest when I heard the distinctive whine of an ATV engine. Rebecca's bright red four-wheeler came tearing across my field, leaving deep ruts in soil where my grandfather had taught me to plant 40 years ago. She parked her ATV in my grandfather's wheat, boots stomping soil he'd taught me to nurture. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," she sneered, pulling out a tablet like a predator with fresh prey. "I'm conducting my weekly security patrol and noticed several code violations on your property. Your fence is 2 inches too high, Mitchell," she said, snapping photos with practiced arrogance. My hands clenched. Those violations were worth more than her Mercedes. I kept my voice calm, the way you do when dealing with someone who clearly doesn't understand they've picked the wrong target. "Ma'am, this is private property. It's not part of your HOA. You're welcome to patrol the streets, but you can't drive through my wheat field." Rebecca looked at me like I'd told her the earth was flat. "Actually, Mr. Mitchell, this old cattle trail is a documented public access road. Any property affecting community standards falls under HOA oversight authority. That's basic homeowners law." She said it with such practiced confidence that most people would have questioned their own understanding. Most people weren't retired federal agents. "I need to see that documentation," I replied, but Rebecca was already taking photos of my fence line, equipment shed, and Ferdinand grazing peacefully in his pasture. Fence height violation, maximum 6 feet in residential areas. Inappropriate agricultural signage visible from community roads. Livestock creates odor and noise disturbances affecting neighbors' property values. She rattled off violations like reading from a well-rehearsed script, making notes after each fabricated offense. "You'll receive formal notification within 48 hours along with compliance information." When she roared off, $10,000 of my harvest lay shredded in her tracks. That afternoon, I spent 3 hours researching property boundaries and easement records. What I found confirmed my suspicions. No public access road crossed my property, no easement gave anyone crossing rights, and absolutely no legal authority for HOA regulation within my property lines. The cattle trail Rebecca mentioned? A path my grandfather had worn driving cattle between pastures entirely within our family's land boundaries. But I discovered something interesting in Greenfield Estates development records. The original environmental impact study specifically noted that Mitchell Farm would remain private agricultural land, providing a natural buffer between residential areas and the state highway. Rebecca's environmental concerns were already proven false by her own development's documentation. Her violation notices piled up like confetti at a funeral. By Thursday, I'd received 3 separate notices, each more elaborate and threatening than the last. The first cited my 40-year-old cattle fence for violating subdivision standards written for quarter-acre house lots. The second complained about my private property signs being aggressive and unwelcoming, suggesting I replace them with neighborly signage promoting community cohesion. The third notice was a masterpiece of bureaucratic overreach, claiming cattle smells created air quality issues negatively impacting neighboring properties and potentially violated environmental protection standards. Each notice featured professional letterhead, official-sounding language about compliance deadlines, and subtle threats about legal action for noncompliance. Rebecca had clearly done this before. These notices were designed to intimidate people who didn't know their rights, using legal-sounding language to make demands seem official and unavoidable. After 25 years dealing with actual federal regulations, I could see through her game immediately. Still, I admired the sophistication of her harassment campaign. This wasn't amateur hour. Rebecca was running a professional operation designed to break resistance through paperwork and persistence. The second week brought Rebecca's campaign to a whole new level. She organized a community standards workshop and sent formal invitations to every Greenfield Estates household, including mine. The invitation was beautifully designed, printed on heavy cardstock, written in diplomatic language that made her sound like a reasonable community leader addressing a difficult situation. Join us for an important discussion about maintaining property values and community standards. We'll be addressing concerns about agricultural operations in residential areas and exploring solutions that work for everyone. I didn't attend, but Eleanor Patterson, who would become one of my most valuable allies, did, and she filled me in on what happened. Rebecca had prepared a PowerPoint presentation with photos of my property, including close-ups of my cattle, equipment, and house, apparently taken while trespassing on my land. She talked about how non-conforming agricultural operations were affecting property values, using carefully selected statistics and market analysis to support her argument. "I'm not saying Mr. Mitchell is a bad neighbor," Rebecca told the crowd of 40-some residents. "But we have to consider the impact of his choices on the investments of 200 families who chose Greenfield Estates." Eleanor told me several neighbors asked reasonable questions about my legal rights and HOA authority over my property. Rebecca's responses were masterful. She never claimed legal authority over my land, but talked about community standards and neighborly cooperation in ways that made me sound unreasonable for not volunteering compliance. She mentioned trying to work with Mr. Mitchell, but that I'd been uncooperative and resistant to mutually beneficial solutions. By meeting's end, she'd successfully painted me as a stubborn holdout selfishly prioritizing personal interests over community well-being. What happens when psychological warfare meets federal training? The predator was about to become prey. The psychological pressure campaign that followed was sophisticated and relentless. Rebecca organized community walks that somehow always ended at my property's edge. Groups of neighbors would gather where Subdivision Road met my fence line, and Rebecca would lead educational tours about property values, community standards, and neighborhood cooperation importance. They never technically trespassed, but stood outside my fence taking photos, making loud comments about the unfortunate situation with my property, discussing how much nicer the neighborhood would be if my land were developed into something more appropriate. These walks happened 3 or 4 times weekly, always at different times with different neighbor groups. Rebecca was methodically introducing every Greenfield Estates resident to what she called the Mitchell problem, ensuring everyone saw my farm as an obstacle to their property values and quality of life. She'd point out how my cattle fence blocked views from certain houses, how farm smells were strongest when wind blew from certain directions, how much more attractive the area would be with proper landscaping and community amenities instead of agricultural structures. But Rebecca's masterstroke was involving government agencies in her harassment campaign. During week 3, I received a call from the county agricultural inspector explaining someone had filed a complaint about my livestock operation. The complaint claimed I was running an unpermitted commercial cattle operation posing environmental and health risks to nearby residential properties. I spent an entire morning walking the inspector through my property, showing records proving my grandfather had registered the land for agricultural use in 1923, decades before surrounding area was even zoned residential. The inspector was apologetic but thorough, explaining he was required to investigate every complaint, even frivolous ones. Between you and me, Mr. Mitchell, he said as we finished inspection, this complaint reads like it was written by someone with legal training who knows exactly which phrases trigger mandatory investigation. Most people don't know specific language about environmental impact on adjacent residential properties or compliance with current agricultural licensing requirements. Whoever filed this knows the system. The inspection found absolutely no violations, but cost me a full work day and added an official government file to what Rebecca was building into a documented pattern of problems with my property. The health department visit came next, triggered by complaints about waste runoff and groundwater contamination from my cattle operation. Again, the inspector was professional but clearly frustrated at responding to obviously retaliatory complaints. My farm had operated under the same environmental guidelines for decades with regular water testing and waste management procedures exceeding county requirements. But Rebecca had filed complaints using specific technical language about nitrogen levels and water table contamination requiring full environmental assessment with soil and water samples taking 2 weeks to process. Week 4 brought escalation that made me realize Rebecca wasn't just trying to annoy me into compliance. She was building a comprehensive legal and social case to force me off my land entirely. The morning started with a 6 a.m. knock. I opened my door to find a process server with a thick envelope of legal documents claiming I was interfering with neighbors' quiet enjoyment of their properties and causing measurable financial harm through reduced property values. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of legal harassment, combining real law with creative interpretation in ways that would be expensive and time-consuming to fight. Even though I was confident I'd eventually win, Rebecca claimed my cattle created noise pollution, my farming equipment violated neighborhood noise ordinances, my property attracted pest animals like coyotes threatening neighborhood pets, and agricultural use was incompatible with surrounding residential character. She was demanding $50,000 in damages and a court order requiring me to bring my property into community standards compliance or cease agricultural operations entirely. But the real gut punch came with the environmental impact assessment Rebecca had commissioned from a private consulting firm. She'd hired professionals to document every aspect of my farming operation that could potentially be framed as harmful to surrounding residential area. The report was 43 pages long, complete with photographs, soil analysis, air quality measurements, and detailed analysis of how my cattle operation allegedly affected everything from local wildlife patterns to neighborhood aesthetic character. It was thorough, professional, and expensive, the kind of document costing tens of thousands of dollars to produce that most people don't have resources to fight. Reading through the environmental report, I began understanding the scope of Rebecca's plan. This wasn't about HOA fees or neighborhood compliance. She was systematically building a legal case forcing me to sell my land, probably at significant loss, to someone who would develop it according to her vision. The report concluded my 40-acre farm was incompatible with surrounding residential land use and recommended the property be transitioned to uses more appropriate for community context. In plain English, Rebecca was using environmental law, nuisance law, and community pressure to steal my family's land. But little did she know, I'd just cracked open a federal database and found her smoking gun. The final straw came on a foggy Thursday morning in early October. I woke to check my wheat field, now just 2 weeks from harvest, and found it destroyed. Someone had driven an ATV through standing grain in a deliberate pattern spelling, "move out," in letters readable from a quarter-mile away. 3 months of work, thousands in seed and fertilizer, anticipation of my best harvest in years, all destroyed in a single night of vandalism. But Rebecca wasn't finished with her message. An hour after I discovered the damage, she arrived with a camera crew and two newspaper reporters. She'd somehow arranged media coverage of what she called a community meeting about property rights and neighborhood standards. Standing in front of my ruined wheat field with cameras rolling and reporters taking notes, Rebecca gave a performance that would have impressed any politician. This situation represents exactly why we need stronger community standards and better cooperation between property owners, she said, gesturing toward destruction behind her. When some people prioritize individual interests over community well-being, everyone suffers. Mr. Mitchell's refusal to work with neighbors has created the kind of tension and conflict nobody wants. She was actually using my destroyed crop as evidence I was a community problem, suggesting vandalism was somehow a natural result of my uncooperative attitude and refusal to engage in constructive dialogue. The reporters ate it up, asking questions about property values, community standards, and whether agricultural operations should be allowed in residential areas. Rebecca answered every question with polished talking points, making her sound reasonable and me sound like a stubborn obstacle to progress. Watching her turn my ruined livelihood into propaganda for her cause, I realized underestimating Rebecca Martinez had been a serious mistake. That night, sitting in my kitchen staring at wheatfield ruins, I made a decision that would change everything. For 25 years, I'd been the federal inspector developers, lawyers, and corrupt officials feared most. A man who knew every database, regulation, and loophole in American land law. I'd been treating this like a neighborly dispute. But Rebecca had declared war. Time to remind myself who I used to be and what I was still capable of doing. I fired up my laptop and logged into federal systems I hadn't accessed in 2 years, using credentials still active thanks to my consulting contract with the Bureau. What I found in the first hour of searching made my hands shake with a combination of rage and excitement. The entire Greenfield Estates development had been built on land with unresolved federal ownership disputes dating back to 1978. A series of bureaucratic errors and incomplete paperwork transfers had left legal title to over 300 acres in administrative limbo where multiple parties could claim ownership, but none had clear, undisputed rights. More importantly, Rebecca knew about it. Her name appeared on dozens of documents related to what files called complex title resolution procedures for Greenfield Estates development. But the real bombshell was buried in a folder of scanned contracts I almost missed. Rebecca had signed an agreement to sell 15 acres of available expansion land to Morrison Development Group for $2.3 million. The contract was dated just 6 weeks ago and specifically included my 40-acre farm as part of the land package being offered for sale. Rebecca was trying to sell property she didn't own, had never owned, and had no legal right to control. She wasn't just harassing me to get out of the neighborhood. She was planning to make millions by stealing my family's land. The scope of Rebecca's fraud became clearer as I dug deeper into federal records. She'd been working with Morrison Development for over 2 years, helping them identify properties throughout the region that could be acquired through administrative pressure and community standards enforcement. My farm wasn't her first target, just the latest in a series of properties Rebecca had helped Morrison acquire by making life unbearable for current owners. The federal database showed similar patterns of harassment, legal pressure, and forced sales in 3 other communities where Rebecca had served as HOA board member or legal consultant. The next morning brought an unexpected ally who would prove crucial to exposing Rebecca's crimes. David Martinez knocked on my door at 6 a.m., looking like he hadn't slept in days and carrying a cardboard box filled with documents. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, voice shaking with exhaustion and anger, "I think my wife has lost her mind, and I need your help to stop her before she destroys both our lives." David had been going through Rebecca's home office after becoming suspicious about her late-night phone calls and mysterious meetings with out-of-town business associates. What David found in Rebecca's files painted a picture of systematic fraud, going far beyond what I discovered in federal databases. She'd been overcharging HOA fees and skimming money from community maintenance budgets for over 2 years. She'd created fake violations to justify thousands in fines collected from residents too intimidated to challenge her authority. Most damaging, she'd forged David's signature on multiple legal documents, including the Morrison development contract and several loan applications using their house as collateral for her business schemes. She's been treating our neighbors like criminals, David told me, voice breaking with emotion. Mrs. Patterson got fined $300 for having the wrong color mailbox. The Johnsons were charged $500 for excessive holiday decorations because they put up Christmas lights in November instead of December. Tom Rodriguez told me Rebecca threatened to have him fired from his security job if he didn't write up violation reports on families she was targeting. David wasn't just offering to help expose his wife's crimes. He was begging me to stop her before she destroyed the lives of everyone in the community. My second crucial ally emerged from an unexpected source that same afternoon. Eleanor Patterson, the 78-year-old retired librarian living 3 houses down from the HOA office, had been keeping meticulous records of Rebecca's activities for over a year. Eleanor had worked as a legal secretary for 40 years before becoming a librarian, and her trained eye had spotted patterns of fraud and abuse invisible to most people. That woman has been running a protection racket, Eleanor told me over coffee in her kitchen, surrounded by boxes of carefully organized paperwork. She finds something wrong with everyone's property, then offers to make the problem go away for a fee. I've been documenting everything, waiting for someone with knowledge and authority to challenge her. Eleanor's records were extraordinary in detail and organization. She documented every fake violation, every irregular fine, every threatening letter, and every suspicious meeting Rebecca had conducted over the past 18 months. She'd even been secretly recording Rebecca's interactions with residents using a small digital recorder her grandson taught her to operate. I may be old, Mr. Mitchell, but I'm not stupid, Eleanor said with a smile that reminded me why librarians had always been some of my favorite people. Rebecca Martinez picked the wrong neighborhood to run her little scam in. We've got a retired federal investigator, a construction engineer who understands fraud, and a former legal secretary who knows how to build a case. She never stood a chance. The Greenfield Estates Community Center had never seen a crowd like the one gathering that Saturday morning in late October. Rebecca had advertised the meeting as a presentation about exciting new development opportunities that would increase property values and enhance community amenities. What she didn't know was that David, Eleanor, and I had been quietly spreading the word about our discoveries, and federal agents were already building a criminal case based on evidence we'd provided. Nearly 200 residents packed the room, along with reporters from 3 local newspapers, a television crew Eleanor had contacted through journalism connections, and several federal agents there to observe what they expected would be Rebecca's final public performance. Rebecca walked into the room wearing her best power suit and carrying a leather briefcase probably costing more than most people's monthly salary. She'd arranged professional audiovisual equipment, hired a photographer to document the meeting, and even brought a bouquet of flowers for the registration table. Everything about her presentation was designed to project success, confidence, and authority. She had no idea she was walking into a carefully orchestrated trap that would end her criminal career and send her to federal prison. "Good morning, everyone," Rebecca began, voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "Today, I'm excited to announce a groundbreaking partnership that will transform our community and significantly increase all our property values." She described Morrison Development Group's agreement to purchase several parcels of underutilized land to create Greenfield Commons, a luxury amenities complex including an 18-hole golf course, country club with full dining and fitness facilities, and high-end retail village. Her first PowerPoint slide showed artist renderings of manicured landscapes and elegant buildings resembling resort brochures. The crowd murmured appreciatively as Rebecca continued describing how property values would increase an estimated 30 to 40% once construction began the following spring. She talked about job creation, increased tax revenue, and prestige of living adjacent to such an exclusive development. Some of you may have concerns about Mr. Mitchell's property, she said, clicking to a slide showing an aerial photo of my farm. I'm pleased to announce legal proceedings are underway to acquire his land through eminent domain for community benefit. The county has determined agricultural use of this property is incompatible with surrounding residential development and that public interest would be better served by incorporating this land into the Greenfield Commons project. It was a masterful performance, combining legitimate-sounding legal language with appealing visions of increased prosperity. Rebecca had clearly done this before, knowing exactly which buttons to push to get homeowners excited about rising property values. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd lied to a room full of people who now knew the truth about her criminal activities. David stood up in the back, face pale but voice steady. Before my wife continues this presentation, he said, I think everyone should know she's been lying to all of you for over 2 years. The room fell silent as David walked to the front carrying a thick folder of documents. Rebecca's confident expression faltered as she realized what was happening, but she tried maintaining control. David, this isn't the appropriate time or place for personal discussions. We can talk about whatever concerns you have at home. But David wasn't stopping. Rebecca has been stealing from this community, creating fake violations to collect illegal fines, and now she's trying to sell land that doesn't belong to her, he said, voice growing stronger with each word. The contract she just showed you? She forged my signature on it. The land she's promising to Morrison Development legally belongs to a federal land trust, and selling it would be a federal crime. The room erupted in shocked gasps and angry voices as residents realized they'd been systematically defrauded by the woman they'd trusted to protect their interests. Rebecca tried regaining control, claiming David was having some kind of personal breakdown and his accusations resulted from marital problems. But Eleanor Patterson stood up next, carrying her own box of evidence. I've been documenting Mrs. Martinez's illegal activities for over a year, Eleanor announced. She's been charging illegal fees, creating fake violations, and threatening residents who questioned her authority. I have recordings, documents, and financial records proving she's been running a criminal operation using this HOA as cover. That's when I stood up, and the room got so quiet you could hear people breathing. My name is James Mitchell, I said, letting my voice carry clearly to every corner. For 25 years, I was chief inspector for the Federal Land Management Bureau. I investigated land fraud, development schemes, and illegal property transfers across 7 states. Everything Rebecca Martinez just told you is based on lies, forgery, and criminal fraud. And I can prove every word of it. I clicked to my own PowerPoint presentation showing official federal land records, banking documents, and contracts exposing the full scope of Rebecca's criminal enterprise. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Federal land records proved Rebecca had no legal right to sell or develop my property. Banking records provided by David showed systematic theft from HOA accounts. Video footage from my security cameras showed Rebecca vandalizing my wheat field and trespassing on my property. Testimony from Eleanor documented a pattern of harassment and extortion victimizing dozens of residents. But the moment that sealed Rebecca's fate came when Agent Sarah Chin from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division stood up in the audience and identified herself. Mrs. Martinez, Agent Chin said, voice carrying unmistakable federal law enforcement authority, you're under investigation for mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, and multiple violations of federal racketeering statutes. Based on evidence we've reviewed, we'll be executing search warrants on your home and office Monday morning. I strongly advise you to contact an attorney immediately. The room erupted in shocked gasps and angry voices as residents realized how thoroughly they'd been victimized by someone they trusted with their community's welfare. Rebecca's final moments as a free woman were pathetic and desperate. She tried claiming everyone was conspiring against her, that I was a bitter old man trying to destroy the community's future, that David was lying because of marital problems. But her voice was shaking, her legal training couldn't explain away bank records and federal documents, and her confident facade had completely crumbled. When Eleanor stood announcing she'd been recording Rebecca's illegal activities for over a year, the crowd's mood shifted from confusion to fury. When Tom Rodriguez confirmed Rebecca had been blackmailing him to write false violation reports, anger became pure rage. A motion to immediately remove Rebecca as HOA chairwoman and freeze all HOA accounts passed by a vote of 147 to 3. Security cameras captured Rebecca leaving the community center in tears while residents shouted questions about their stolen money, fake violations, and lies she'd told about my property. Local news coverage that evening led with the headline, HOA Chairwoman Exposed in $1 Million Fraud Scheme. By Monday morning, the story had been picked up by regional and national media outlets fascinated by the scope and audacity of Rebecca's criminal enterprise. 8 months after that confrontational October morning, Rebecca Martinez stood in federal court pleading guilty to multiple counts of mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, and violating federal racketeering statutes. The woman who had terrorized an entire community with fake violations and illegal fees now faced up to 20 years in federal prison. Judge Patricia Williams didn't mince words during the sentencing hearing. Mrs. Martinez, you violated the trust of over 200 families who believed you were working in their best interests. Instead, you systematically stole from them while planning to sell their community out from under them for personal profit. This kind of fraud strikes at the very heart of what makes communities function and thrive. Rebecca received 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years supervised probation, and was ordered to pay full restitution of over $600,000 to the Greenfield Estates community. Her law license was permanently revoked, assets seized to pay restitution, and she was banned from serving in any HOA leadership position for life. Morrison Development Group faced their own federal investigation and were eventually convicted of conspiracy and bribery in connection with Rebecca's scheme. The company was dissolved, executives went to prison, and their planned luxury development became a cautionary tale studied in law schools and business ethics courses. David Martinez, who had shown extraordinary courage exposing his wife's crimes despite personal cost, was elected new HOA chairman by unanimous vote. His first act was establishing a completely transparent governance system where all financial records were public, all major decisions required community votes, and no single person could make unilateral changes to community rules. Monthly HOA fees dropped from $200 to $50, covering only basic maintenance and insurance. The community voted to eliminate over 80% of Rebecca's arbitrary rules, keeping only regulations that genuinely protected property values and safety. What had once been an oppressive system of petty tyranny became a model of democratic community governance that other neighborhoods throughout the state began copying. David worked with local government officials to establish new oversight requirements for HOAs, ensuring the kind of systematic fraud Rebecca had perpetrated couldn't happen again. The Mitchell Act, named after my role in exposing corruption, now requires all HOAs in the state to undergo annual independent audits, make financial records publicly available to community members, and submit to regular oversight by county officials. The federal investigation led to broader HOA oversight reforms throughout the region and helped expose similar fraud schemes in communities across 3 states. Real estate attorneys serving as HOA board members must now disclose all potential conflicts of interest and submit to additional professional oversight. Federal prosecutors used Rebecca's case as a template for investigating other corrupt HOA officials, leading to dozens of additional prosecutions and millions of dollars in recovered stolen funds. What started as one woman's harassment campaign against a stubborn farmer had grown into a nationwide reform movement protecting thousands of homeowners from similar abuse. My 40-acre farm became an unexpected symbol of property rights and community resistance to corruption. The wheat field Rebecca had destroyed was replanted and produced the best harvest in 25 years, yielding enough grain to cover legal expenses and fund a scholarship program for local high school students planning to study agriculture or law. Ferdinand, my prize bull, became something of a local celebrity. Children from the neighborhood would ask their parents to drive by the farm just to see the famous bull who helped stop the bad lady. Local tour groups began including my farm on their routes, and I started giving talks about property rights and community activism to interested visitors. The community voted to rename the main road Mitchell Boulevard and erected a historical marker explaining how a retired federal inspector had saved their neighborhood from fraud and corruption. The marker includes a bronze plaque with Ferdinand's image and the inscription, "Sometimes the best defense against those who abuse power is simply refusing to be moved." Local law schools began using the case as a teaching tool, and I was invited to speak at conferences about property rights, community governance, and the importance of standing up to corruption. The case became required reading in several criminal justice programs and was featured in a documentary about HOA abuse that won several journalism awards. But the most satisfying change was the transformation of the community itself. Where Rebecca had created fear, suspicion, and division through her reign of terror, David's leadership fostered cooperation and genuine neighborly support. The HOA budget that had once funded Rebecca's harassment campaigns now supported community gardens where families grew vegetables together, holiday celebrations that brought the whole neighborhood together, and a scholarship fund that had already helped 12 local students attend college. The same neighbors who had once cowered under Rebecca's arbitrary rules now worked together to create a place where families genuinely wanted to live and raise their children. Eleanor Patterson became the community historian, documenting lessons learned from what everyone now called the Rebecca era and ensuring future residents understood how important it was to maintain vigilance against corruption and abuse of power. Tom Rodriguez was promoted to Community Security Director and established programs that actually made residents feel safer instead of surveilled, working with local police to create neighborhood watch programs and emergency response protocols that brought people together instead of dividing them. The community center that had once been the site of Rebecca's authoritarian meetings became a hub of democratic activity, hosting town halls, volunteer coordination meetings, and social events that celebrated the diversity and strength of the neighborhood. As I finish this story, 4 years have passed since that October confrontation that changed everything. Rebecca is serving her sentence at a minimum security federal prison in Arizona, working in the prison library and reportedly studying for a degree in social work, a career change that strikes me as both ironic and oddly hopeful. David has remarried a wonderful woman named Sandra who teaches elementary school and treats the community leadership role as service rather than a throne. Their approach to HOA governance has become a model other communities study and adopt, proving neighborhoods can be managed democratically and transparently without sacrificing effectiveness or property values. Morrison Development Group went bankrupt during the federal investigation, and its executives faced their own legal consequences that sent a clear message to other developers who might consider similar schemes. The land they had planned to develop illegally was eventually purchased by the county and turned into a nature preserve providing hiking trails and wildlife habitat for the entire region. Ferdinand is now 13 years old and still the undisputed king of his pasture, though he spends most of his time these days peacefully grazing and accepting treats from neighborhood children who consider him a local hero. The wheat field that sparked this whole conflict has become something of a pilgrimage site for property rights advocates and community activists from across the country. I get letters from farmers, homeowners, small business owners, and community leaders facing their own battles with corrupt officials, abusive HOAs, and fraudulent development schemes. Some visit the farm to see where it all happened, and I'm always happy to share what I learned about fighting back against abusive power while building communities that actually serve their residents' interests. The most important lesson I share with these visitors is that bullies and fraudsters count on their victims being isolated, confused, and afraid to challenge authority. But when communities come together, when people share information and support each other, when they refuse to be intimidated by official sounding threats and fake legal authority, even the most sophisticated criminal schemes can be exposed and defeated. Rebecca's fraud succeeded for as long as it did because she convinced people she had legitimate authority, that her rules were real law, and that challenging her would be futile and expensive. Standing in my wheat field today, watching Ferdinand chew grass contentedly while children from Greenfield estates visit with their parents to hear the story of how their community fought back against corruption, I'm reminded that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about restoration and prevention. Rebecca's fraud was exposed, her victims were compensated, and the community she tried to exploit became stronger, more democratic, and more resistant to future abuse. The land she tried to steal for millions of dollars is still here, still growing wheat, still home to a bull who unknowingly became the symbol of resistance against tyranny and greed. The sign at the entrance to my farm still reads Mitchell Family Farm, established 1923, but now includes a new line the community voted to add, protected by law and community. Because that's what this story is really about, not just one man's fight against a corrupt HOA chairwoman, but an entire community's decision to choose transparency over secrecy, cooperation over domination, democracy over authoritarianism, and justice over fear. And Ferdinand? He's still the champion of his domain, grazing peacefully where justice grew, in a field where the wheat grows tall and the community knows that truth will always triumph over lies when neighbors look out for each other against those who would abuse power for personal gain.